Hello, and welcome to Stories Across Borders. Here we discuss stories told across a wide range of different media books, movies, games, comics, all of it, really. The only rule is that we can only discuss things in terms of the writing. Anything like acting, animation, mechanics, etc., is out unless it relates directly to how the story is being told. I'm fixing my mic. I'm also Daniel Radford, author, walking repository of stories, and your host, and I'm joined once more by John Kernan, as I so often am.
Hello.
Hello indeed. So, this episode is a bit of a break from the norm, actually. This is not the start of a new cycle. It is actually our season 2 finale. It is wild that we have even made it this far.
I knew we could do it.
It just takes a bit of dedication, and it's not like we're going to run out of media to talk about anytime soon.
No. New things are always going to come out faster than we could even consume them, let alone talk about them.
We've demonstrated that plenty this cycle.
The
Uh,
struggle is real.
so, so for real. But on that note, to get our full mileage out of this very special episode, uh, we're actually breaking our formula a little bit. We don't have a theme this time. This time around, we're just going to sort of sit around and talk about some of our favorites, some favorite stories of ours that haven't really made it into episodes yet for one reason or another. Not that that precludes them from from happening in the future. It's just they haven't fit the themes, or we've had to choose for a theme or whatever, or just hasn't occurred to us at the time, or didn't exist yet, whatever. It's also the first time that there's a chance one of us might not know all of the stories being discussed, so that could be interesting.
Always interesting.
The way this is going to work, each of us have sort of a list of various stories from across different mediums. We definitely aren't going to get through all of them because they're probably fairly long lists. We both like a lot of stories, but that just means more content for the future.
Content.
And we do like content here. So to get us started, why don't you actually lead us in and start us off with like a book or book series that you particularly like?
I haven't been reading as many books recently as I wish I had. But what I have gotten back in with me, I know we talked about it on the podcast before, but as far as books, it's what's relevant to me right now is the Chronicles of Narnia books.
I knew it. I knew this was going to happen. I should have put money on this.
I I love those books. I always have talked about them already on the podcast a long time ago, but like I I always end up loving them because it's just because both of like the popularity of the first movie. I don't remember if the second one was as popular at the time. So many people who ended up hearing about the Chronicles of Narnia through the movie or might just not read books while only a couple of movies got made and there are 7 books, have no idea how much further and how much deeper in that world goes just because some of his books are entirely different from the others. Some of the books in the series literally have no overarching plot that connects to any of the others. Ultimately, like, ugh. And then the secret origin story of the magician's nephew, and just it's such a it's such an interesting story. And I know not everybody can write that many books, but I just sometimes find myself wishing there were more like big series of books that had 1 or 2 books that was like, okay, so here's an entire book's worth of stuff that has nothing to do with the main characters, the big, huge worldwide struggles, and hell, maybe it even takes place in a country that has been in this world the whole time and has only ever been mentioned offhand in any of the other stories because it's not relevant to any of them.
Yeah, it's easy to forget how expansive the multiverse of the Narnia books actually is.
Yeah, like Narnia is a huge there's kind of the world of Narnia, but people also forget that Narnia is actually just one country within that world.
And that
And
world is one of many worlds.
yeah, and like for instance, I think my favorite Narnia book is actually one of those ones that has nothing to do with the others. It's called I'm getting the order mixed up thanks to dyslexia. I can't remember if it's a boy and his horse or a horse and his boy, but I think it's a
I
horse
think
and his
it's a
boy.
I think it's a horse and his boy, but it's been a
And
very
is
long time since I've read them.
it's an entire book that takes place during the time when the original four children are the kings and queens of Narnia, despite them not even being in it, besides making like a short little appearance. And it's just about a kid who's a slave and having a rough time and sad and escapes slavery through like ending up with the horse of some noble dude from I always forget what the country is called, but it's very obviously based on a mixture of various Middle Eastern and I think probably more specifically Arabic kingdoms. And hey, so, turns out the horse talks. And
It's a
like
talking animal in Narnia. Say it ain't so.
yeah, but that's one of the best parts, is like they're not in Narnia. And so then you get into the
You know
context
what I
of, oh,
meant.
right. No, no, no. I know. I'm saying it's an interesting point though, because it's like it's easy. You wouldn't even realize just from watching the movies and most of the books that it's like, oh, right. Not only is Narnia only one country in this world, it's also the most magical one, and a lot of the other countries are a lot more mundane and normal and human centric and have these countries that have no talking animals right next to this country where all the animals talk,
Yeah, now that
which
you
makes
mention it,
Narnia a huge, massive oddity.
it like I never even thought about it, but you're right. And Narnia must look so weird. Like it must seem so out, like straight up bizarre to its neighbors.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons like getting into some of the a little bit of the political end of it is like so interesting because this horse, like you said, a horse talking in Narnia, which is what clicked to me. That's like, yeah, this talking horse is special by being a talking horse, except also he's just a horse from Narnia. He's not a special enchanted horse or a horse who learned to talk. He's a horse from Narnia that was captured and sold to another country because obviously the creatures of Narnia are an oddity and would be very, very popular to poachers and slavers and stuff. And that's how this talking horse ended up being the nobleman's like war horse because obviously he's a high quality horse. He's a good breed, raised happily in Narnia. He's magical, which means he's extra smart. But
Yeah,
I don't even remember. I don't think any of them knew he could talk. He didn't talk until he met this like lonely, poor, sad little boy who's got like nobody else in the world, which not only allows them to create this connection and have a haha goofy fun adventure with a kid and a talking animal, but also it's the adventure of a lowborn, poor street urchin and a noble high class because not only is the horse from Narnia where he was like just a person, he spent all his time as the war horse of here as the war horse of somebody important. So he's high class. He's even a little snobby.
it's definitely a funny juxtaposition to have the human be the lowborn and the beast of burden, the snobby highborn character. And it's the sort of thing you can only get in a bizarre, whimsical world like Narnia. And honestly, there's the wildest thing about, like, not narratively, but about the Chronicles of Narnia, and perhaps one of the saddest things is that I wonder how many people don't even realize that the Chronicles of Narnia are actually the Chronicles of Narnia, because the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is by far the best known story in the franchise. It is the one that's been adapted the most. It was my first introduction to it. I saw a play of the Chronicles of Narnia as a child, and
And
that
if I
was my
remember
introduction
right, I
of the
think it
Lion, the Witch,
was
and the Wardrobe, I should say. That was my introduction.
I think it was the first one written and published too, if I remember right. I don't think
I
I
think
think
that,
the I have to double check, but I think the origin story, like the magician's nephew and stuff, might actually be like prequels that were written later. I'm not
well,
sure.
that's the thing, because in the box set I had, as a kid, right? The first one in that series, in the list, was The Magician's Nephew,
Yeah, it's the
which to
same thing
me
with the one I have.
implies which implies to me that it's the first one that was created, because normally when a series of books is put out, the stories are given to you in release order, not in the order of the chronology of the story. So that makes me think The Magician's Nephew was actually the first story. I'm not sure. We can check. I can do a quick Google.
It looks like no, yeah, I think I was right because I think all the collections are actually in chronological order. Well, most of them, at least. Like the one I have, it says The Magician's Nephew was 1955, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was
Oh
50.
wow! It's actually the sixth published of the seven novels, The Magician's
Yeah,
Nephew.
they're consistently like fairly out of order. Like The Horse and His Boy was the most recent one also before The Magician's Nephew. It starts out with just the for the most part the chronicle or the chronological stories with it's got the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Oh, I forgot about the Silver Chair. I think that's the one I remember the least.
Isn't that the one with like the time guy in it?
I have to go through that again. I believe, yeah, I believe you're right. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is when they go on the big old boat, but I think the Silver Chair is another one where it's not necessarily following just the big important main kings and queens.
Yeah, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is, I think that's the fourth book, because or something in the chronology, because I think that follows Prince Caspian.
Oh yeah, I believe
That's
you're
interesting that
right.
they're usually released in chronological order. But no, I mean, yeah, I mean, goes to show you, like, even us who are reasonably familiar with the stories didn't necessarily have all the information about them, and it just goes to say, like, show how much deeper that those stories run than they
Yeah,
actually do. Well, than they actually do, than they appear and that people realize.
looking at a chronology of the books, I love the way uh, I love the way Lewis actually just decides to flesh out the world because at first he is going with his important big main story. We've got the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then Prince Caspian, which is the four kids coming back and finding a new king who actually is from that world to be the king and all that because the world can't just keep having visitors from another world show up, come around for a while, and then go back to their own world and forget about it all over again. Eventually, they have to return to their own home and grow up, which is heavily evidenced in Prince Caspian by the two older siblings kind of becoming less and less kingly and queenly and fit to be a part of this world, while Edmund and Lucy have to really step up. And we've got to go with the Prince Caspian, but then first he starts to shred out the world by being like, okay, let's bring back just a couple characters this time. And look, Caspian's all grown up. He's not happy to just sit in Narnia all the time and just be a stagnant kind of king. He's going to go explore the world, discover new lands, chart everything, and we get to see all these expanded islands and all the parts. And who's one of the new characters we bring along? It's little Eustace Scrub, who is almost exactly Dudley from Harry Potter if Dudley had the spine and intelligence to actually grow and become a better person with time.
To be fair,
Boiled little
he
kid
kinda
doesn't want to
did
be there.
in the, like, last book, though
Oh,
the
of
yeah,
course,
very
he did a
briefly, but
little bit, but like Eustace
yeah,
actually gets
it's
to come
not
and
as well
be
done, but
it. It's like if Dudley turned out to be a little magical and got dragged to Hogwarts, and we got to see that all happen almost,
but it's
and
like if
that
he had it, I mean, you can keep it even simpler. It's like he got to have his actual character arc displayed on screen as part of the story.
yeah, and then I love it because he only actually gets further and further away from all of the more main characters and all those stories from there up until he decides to write the last battle and is literally just like, okay, the silver chair. Eustace got his character arc. We got to see him grow. But he was also growing into becoming a main character there only really just by the later part of the story, which means now he's strong enough, good enough, kind enough, and has enough character to actually be a main character. So now we get to see him bring some come back as the main character in the silver chair and bring somebody with him and bring an entirely other new kid into Narnia, and we get to see how this grown mature Eustace gets to deal with being technically the experienced one and guiding someone through Narnia more or less, even though in the last story he was the scraggly tag along who only came into his own partway through. And we get to see them explore the world with no guides, nobody who's been around and is some great king or queen to help them through. It's literally just two kids in the world of Narnia, off in some part that's not organized and not the nice, pretty kingdom, going around looking for stuff. And
Yeah.
then the horse and his boy, we already got into that. That couldn't be less important until like near the end when there's some war stuff going on.
I think the story that I particularly want to part of Narnia that I think we should particularly touch on, because let's be honest, we could do entire episodes on each individual book very easily. But you
Probably, yeah.
mentioned the last battle, and I think that's actually a really important one to talk about, because correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that the apocalypse?
The last battle is the apocalypse, and it doesn't even hesitate to have all this apocalyptic, cataclysmic imagery. Like, for instance, it starts with the Narnia equivalent of a false messiah because a lion skin from some poachers rolls down a waterfall and into an area and ends up falling onto this sad, humble little donkey who just kind of hangs out all the time and works with this mean, like greedy but smart orangutan who might as well be King Louis because he's he's almost like King Louis with no power and no influence, but all the same ambition and greed because he wants nothing more than to have money and power, even though he doesn't because he is an orangutan living in the jungle.
Yeah,
And
but
he
I
sees
meant
this as a perfect opportunity because Aslan, the god of this, the Jesus and god of this world, is a lion. And there's a lot of innocent, not too bright animals who would be really easy to fool with that.
yeah, but you see, I mean, the fact that the Chronicles of Narnia in order are basically Genesis through Exodus isn't new information really. I think a lot of people who are at least a little familiar know that the religious symbolism is very much in there. It's the fact that, and again, it's been a long time, so maybe I'm remembering this wrong, but I think from memory, they really do end the world.
Yes, the world is ended. The good guys more the physical material battle, they don't win.
But that's the thing. I remember reading that, and it didn't feel entirely like a bad thing.
No, they don't even present it as a bad thing. They present it
Yeah,
as a natural thing, that the natural course of things even.
even all of the even the current ruler, all the previous kings, queens, Aslan, used to like all these characters, all of it accept that this is a normal, natural thing that it has to happen, and it's kind of nice to see a story, especially one that's aimed at young people, saying eras end and that's okay. Things change and come to a close, and that is part of the natural order. It makes sense. It's normal. It's fine. It's meant to be that way.
Yeah,
It's not the end of it's not the end of
what's
stories.
important and what's good to hold on to is the memories. These these things happened. These stories occurred, which I think is actually I think he probably always planned on that because it makes it fit in really well with it being called the Chronicles of Narnia, because that means by extension these are literally the written down chronicles of a dead
I mean,
world
yeah,
that is gone and past.
but you see, I like it for a couple of reasons. One, we know, and some of those other characters know, that it's not the end of everything. There's still more out there. There's still more stories. There's still more world because we've seen that world between the worlds, all the little pools, each one of those another world. Takes the edge out a little bit and adds some really nice symbolism to the story because over those seven, over all those different stories, the target audience is going to have grown and changed and are probably going to be at a point of their lives where it's very important to hear that message that things come to a close,
Yeah, it
and
definitely
that's
hit me really hard at the
fine.
time.
That's okay. That's the normal way for things to be. It's not the end of everything. You're going to be all right. The world will still go on. And I mean, that's a beautiful sentiment, and it's a beautiful series of
Yeah.
stories, and I hope that even as adults, because I'm confident most of our listeners are, that people who aren't as familiar with these stories go back and give them a chance. Because whilst The Lord of the Rings is generally regarded as the origin of modern fantasy, we've talked about this before, but the Chronicles of Narnia was released at around about the same time and has a subtler influence, perhaps, but it is still one of the building blocks that fantasy was built on.
Yeah, and I think it's also like it's at least the best example I can think of off the top of my head of like religious imagery and representation in stories, because there is nothing like oppressive and suffocating about like all the religious ideas that are presented
No,
in the story and the way they affect the
it's an
world. He
inspiration,
I
it's
don't
not
know how
rubbing
many
it in your
examples
face
I
and
could.
trying to convert you, it's just he was a religious person who had that as inspiration for the worlds he crafted.
And he implements that in such a good way because that's one of the things I was thinking of. It where he used it really well, especially at the ending, like you were mentioning. Not only does he tell us that everything ends and it's okay, but one thing ending also doesn't mean another thing
Yeah.
can't begin. And of course, in this very Christian story, we have our equivalent to heaven. The world ends, the good guys, quote unquote, lose, but those who were good and noble and fought for everything they possibly could to the last moment got to go to the other side and find their place, be happy. We get this pretty little cycle of like all the characters running along with Aslan to like this new bigger version of Narnia, and they keep running and they keep finding newer, bigger, even more beautiful places until they finally settle down and stop and relax and just let their lives be now that they've truly found where they're meant to be and the place they were.
On the note of the conclusion, that's actually probably a good place to move on. We don't want to do a whole episode on Narnia when it's supposed to
Yeah.
be about so many other things. Which, I mean, I have a pretty sizable list of books here to bring up, and honestly, most of them I don't think you'd be familiar with. But, uh, you know, let's not go too dark and depressing. And if we find we have trouble talking about the things that only one of us really knows, we can just move on to another one. Uh, so I want to talk about another a more recent, not super recent, a more recent story in the sci-fi genre called The Swarm by Frank Schatzing. It's originally
Ooh.
Norwegian, I think, or maybe German, or somewhere around there. It's specifically it's in the sci-fi genre, but it is an eco thriller, and I mention it. I'll give you a rundown and then explain perhaps why it made such a big impact on me. So it's divided into parts, following a bunch of different characters from all over the world as they start coming across weird anomalies in the ocean. new species of worms suddenly popping up and destroying hydrate ice flows, orcas suddenly acting mysteriously, deadly shrimp appearing out of nowhere, and there's almost always,
Ooh,
this weird, like, jelly-like goo on these scenes, and every now and then it seems that you catch sight of this goo moving and things like that, and as the story progresses, the events around these weird happenings start becoming more and more severe. To like getting we eventually get to like full-blown disasters like continental shelves collapsing in something called a Storega slide, which is just a landslide but on a way bigger scale, causing these massive tsunamis and things like that.
a landslide so big that it causes more landslides, and it's a disaster that cascades into more and more
Kinda,
other
yeah.
disasters.
And it always seems to be linked to this goo in some way. And eventually, with huge, horrible disasters spiraling further and further out of control all around the world, all these characters are finally brought together on this like frigate. Actually, it's an airship character carrier that's been an airship carrier, an aircraft carrier that has been modified out in the middle of the ocean. All these mostly scientists and experts in marine life and things like that are brought together to try and solve the problem. And what they eventually figure out is that there is another intelligent life form existing in the ocean, and this is how they are retaliating for all the pollution and noise pollution and just damage that human activity has done to the oceans. So they've come to the conclusion that in order for them to survive and other marine life to survive, life on the land, especially human life, has to go. Oil mining comes up a lot as well, like oil drilling. And I mean, it's a great message. It's nothing new as far as the message, right? Although it's still a very compelling one that is still very relevant now. But what I really love about it is that it's the best representation of a truly alien intelligence I have ever come across in a story. Because the Ur, as they're dubbed, because of a typo, the guy didn't know what to call them, and mashed his fingers across the keyboard, went, "That'll do," which I which I love.
Honestly, more things should be named that way.
Uh, they're single-celled organisms. And they pass information through their genetic code by coming together and then separating into these goo balls, basically. And they can do other things like manipulate the brains and of other creatures and things like that. They're responsible for the worms that are eating the hydrates, which are destabilizing the shelves, which causes the tsunamis and things like that. They managed to stop the Gulf Stream at some point through all this stuff, through manipulating the environment under the water and the creatures within it. But that's how they work, is that they don't have brains like we do. They collectively are a mind that sort of comes together and passes information through genetics and altering their DNA and gene codes, and then separating again and coming together with other conglomerates and things like that. Which means that they, as a species, have decided humanity needs to fuck off.
Yeah, and I really enjoy it because you it's so easy to like extract the year from that bit and really just say it's like this it's nature feeling itself be destroyed by the influence of humanity and all the shit we do and just being like, man, it's gotta stop. I
Yeah,
get rid of you guys.
it's
You're bad
also
for
all of the
everybody.
all of the science in the book is very thoroughly researched. So it is all written in a way that is scientifically plausible, which adds to it as well.
I love that.
There's a lot of human drama done as well, which makes the book feel bloated in places. But when you step back and think about it, it's very intentionally done this way because it contrasts the way the human experience is to the Ur, which is YRR for anyone who's wondering. It's in there to show this is what people are, how they think and act. It is so different to these creatures. They are truly completely alien, They might come from the same planet, but they are vastly different to the way the human mind and experience is. And that resonated strongly with me for a lot of reasons. Firstly, because when aliens appear in media, 9 times out of 10, they are just green humans, you know? Not necessarily explicitly green humans, but they are basically just humans with some funny makeup on.
Yeah, they're already people by our normal Earth understanding of
Yeah,
what people
maybe
is.
maybe another like point 0.5, maybe more than that even. We'll say like point 0.8 of the time. You'll get instead they're like angels or devils and things inspired by human mythology, which in turn have a distinctly human element as a result. It is so rare to get an alien creature in a sci-fi story that is a truly alien intelligence that feels intellectually distinct from the way human beings experience the world and think.
Yeah, it's the actual definition
Yes,
of alien. It is something entirely other.
yes, exactly. And it being the way it being written in a way that feels plausible scientifically helps with that a lot as well. It adds that a sort of sense of genuineness to it, of realism, and yeah, it's a book. Again, it can be a bit of a slog to get through because again, it's padded with that human drama a lot of the time that feels completely out of place.
Rama.
If you're not thinking about it, you're like, I really don't care about Grey Fox Sigur's relationship problems or the journalist banging the marine, but over by the end of the book, if you sit back and deconstruct and think about it, you go, "Oh, it's in there because it's illustrating the difference between the Ur and the human race. It is showing us how completely different we are, and how despite that we have to find a way to coexist. Otherwise, we're gonna all die."
Yeah, these are two forces that the world cannot reliably survive and facilitate clashing into each other until one is dead.
It's interesting because it creates two almost themes that almost feel opposed, but that are integrated so well together that it fits. Which is the first is that as human beings, we will never truly understand an alien consciousness. It brings up like the religious side of this as well. This idea that a god may well exist, but if there is a higher power, it's not going to be a white guy with a beard. It's not gonna be a
No.
normal, just a human big but bigger and more powerful. That doesn't make sense. It's the height of the human ego to assume that God is just us. If there is a higher power out there, it is going to be completely incomprehensible. Which is it'd be like ants trying to figure out what we're up to.
Yeah, why would we be able to understand whatever or whoever God is if we have still yet to even understand more than a tiny fraction
Yeah,
of their
exactly.
creations?
Which is something that's frequently philosophically expressed in this story, as is the same notion of, if there's aliens out there, and let's be honest, there are aliens out there. I don't know where they are. I'm not saying they're here. I think realistically, chances are high a human race will never come into contact with an alien species. But just statistically speaking, other life is out there. And if for some reason we come across it, we're not going to be able to understand it. Certainly not without putting a lot of work in. It's gonna, they're gonna be vastly different to us. We shouldn't expect anything we discover to behave like people.
Yeah, the only thing we can really hope on that scale is that if that day ever comes, humanity and whatever other species we meet out there will not just instantly stupidly be hostile to each other for no reason.
Sure. But by the same token, and I mean, it's a spoiler for the end of the book, but it's a long book. I don't think a lot of people are going to go out of their way to read it. To be honest, in the end, they find a way to non-hostilely end the conflict, at least for the time being. the bottom line is humanity still has to clean up its act and and sort out the ocean situation. But it ends with things being more or less okay. And the message there, the implied message there is that just because you are vastly different to someone else or something else doesn't mean you can't find a way to communicate and coexist. It's just that you're not going to have that innate understanding. That coexistence is going to take work, and I think that is also a important message. So you got this book with these all this philosophy about about different types of intelligence, the overarching eco thriller plot line and the messages there, as well as this undertone at the end of the possibility of existing harmoniously with those who are different to you. There's a lot of really good pertinent stuff in that book that really resonated with me. So I thought it was a good one to mention because despite the fact it's actually a bestseller, almost no one I meet knows it exists. I wonder if it was maybe bigger in Europe.
That's probably part of it. It is a
Or
German book from a
Norwegian or
German
something
author.
like that. Oh,
I
probably
don't know.
German
Google
then.
said German, but that's just Google.
Oh, yeah, I was like, it's definitely that part of the world. Yeah, but German, fair enough.
Yeah, it always kind of sucks how that stuff doesn't tend to travel a bit more. I mean, to a point it does. Like when I looked up the Swarm a little while ago, it showed that there's I think a movie that came out recently and also an older
Yeah, that's
series,
about
or maybe I
bees.
have that ordered backwards.
It's not.
Well, no, there's also like it's yeah, it says 2023
Wait,
sci-fi
really?
show The
Did they do
Swarm.
it? Because
It says they
I
did
was,
last year,
I've
yeah.
been frustrated by this for a long time. That the movie was. Yeah, no, it's not that. Damn. Because the movie rights were bought, but no one ever did anything with it. And I can understand why. It would be a very
Yeah, I don't see the movie unfortunately.
wait, no, here it is. This one says the sh
There's the show though on the CW
Swarm TV
apparently.
series 2023 not rated. Oh god, it is. It is. They finally did it. Oh man, I need to find where I can watch this. I'm so happy.
It's always nice to find that something you like has
At
been genuinely
last.
adapted. Especially something that seems a little like seems not to be spreading as far as you'd hope amongst like people who aren't
I
way
mean,
into the reading.
it was like the movie rights and like had been bought and it for and they just sat there for a long time. So to see that it exists as of last year because I stopped looking. 'Cause it was like being made as of like 2014 or something, and I just stopped looking. But it exists now. I am so incredibly thrilled. I love this podcast. I will have to find where
Yeah.
I can watch that in Australia. That is really good news. But yeah, go read that book. Go watch the show that apparently exists now.
Yeah, I'm excited to look into that
Speaking
later.
of shows, do you want to keep doing books for a bit, or do you want to move on to some other media? Because obviously we don't have unlimited time, even though we figure this might be a bit of a longer episode.
You know, I was just thinking of a book a minute ago, and I started looking at all that other stuff, and
Because
now
I
I've
mean, I
lost it.
definitely have other books I can touch on, but
Oh, I need to read
I
more.
mean, yeah, I've set myself a goal. I need to read at least 20 books this year because I dropped off and didn't read nearly enough the last couple of years. I've been too focused on my own work. Uh, but if we want, we can come back around to some like books and comics and stuff perhaps later on. Um, why don't we, for the moment, move on to say, let's do live action film and TV.
I haven't seen as much of that lately as I'd like either, but I've been looking at a couple things, partially thanks to Dear Ghoulies influence. But like one is The Blacklist, which is very enjoyable, even though it is also aggressively like American fucking like spy action political
Yeah, I
thriller.
watched the first season of that a long
It's
time ago, and I really enjoyed it, and just never got around to watching the rest.
Yeah, it's definitely my favorite incarnation of like that that's longer than an hour or two that I've ever seen. Um, besides maybe Metal Gear, which is uh its own
Yeah, we'll do
entire
games later.
existence. But I I enjoy Blacklist a lot, even though there's also plenty of things I could criticize of it later. Was the one thing that constantly pulls on Blacklist and drags it down despite all its good stuff is the main character Elizabeth Keene, the drama around her family and her wanting to know anything and everything about anybody who might be blood related to her and who her father is never
That's the
stops
impression I got.
ever ever.
I might have even got through a couple of seasons, but I do remember that sort of being like the central mystery of the show, and even early on, you could tell that they were going to drag that out for as long as they possibly could.
The real big problem with it is that, I mean, at least it's not nearly as bad as it could be, because although I say it never stops, it's not the same drama just going on forever. We eventually find out who her dad is. Then we find out who her dad is again. And then it's like, okay, wow, but who's her mother? Wow, that's who her mother is? But wait, we don't know about her. Who is her mother really? What's she
It feels
like?
like it's
And
like shifting the
then
focus away
then
from the actual central premise of the show, the Blacklist, to be about the mysteries of her family.
well, the real problem with it isn't even that there. It's Elizabeth. It's how much she cares about the mystery of her family. That's what really gets old, is even when we get to a point where it's like she's relaxed, she's over it, she's starting to be a character again who's mixed in with all the other characters, then she splits off from everybody again to be like, oh, but my family. And I'm like, shut up. You have your fucking family. It's all these characters in the show we've been seeing that we care about. Stop caring about these people who aren't a part of your life, you dumb little idiot. Why are you so smart in everything else and so stupid when it comes to your blood relatives?
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's maybe like I think that's part of why I've had trouble getting back into it. Like, it's funny, right? It's like so often a show can be fantastic in every example, but there's just this one thing that irks you enough that you just can't really go back to it. Like, I mean, this isn't going to be my pick, but I think an example of that that I can give, there's a similar, not the same problem, but a similar ballpark problem, right? Is a show called Scorpion. Yeah, it's, you
Oh,
know,
I've heard of
this group of
Scorpion.
geniuses is contracted by the government to use their brains to solve like national security problems and things like that. Uh Here's the problem with it though. Is allegedly based on the life of this guy Walter. I think that was his name. And you know, I don't think he's listening, so I'll put a big this is alleged, this is my opinion on it just to be safe, you know. I think it's bullshit. The whole thing ends up feeling like a big millions of dollars expense to blow up this guy's ego because he wants to feel smart. I don't even buy that he's as intelligent as he's portraying himself by a mile. I mean, you can
Oh
tell
man.
because I know because you can see what he looks like, and the actor they hired to play him is a very good-looking dude, whilst he is himself just a guy. Um,
That always feels weird when you see like the real picture of someone who is a character in a movie and you're like, "Oh, you look why did they pick someone so chiseled and handsome and perfect to play this dude?"
it ends up just feeling like a vanity project centered around this one character, when there's this entire cast of infinitely more interesting characters, and because they continuously focus on him because it's apparently his story, even if it is completely fiction, we end up not getting enough out of the much more interesting parts of the show, which is these other characters who have much more believable stories. And I think it's that same sort of brand of problem that you're describing in the Blacklist, where everything becomes centered around this singular conceit of the show, and it ends up deflecting away from the other characters who are interesting and the actual base premise of the show. to focus entirely on the life of this one character, and it stops being about what it's supposed to be about.
Yeah, it's a bummer, and it's especially annoying in the case of Blacklist because I like Elizabeth. She's the
Yeah, I mean,
main character,
at
and
least
that's
she's
okay.
likable.
She's a great character. She's a great character when she's interacting with all the other important characters that we like, and this group of people who work together, this little found family that over like 10 seasons we've been growing attached to and coming to love. Except for all the moments where she's just constantly separating from them to do her own shit that I was invested in for a while and then had conclusions and keeps coming back and it won't just stop. And I'm,
Yeah.
please.
I will give them credit for one thing though, because I believe the Blacklist was the one that did this. Their final or penultimate season, it might have been, was being developed during the epidemic, during COVID. Not that COVID is ever really going
Yep.
to end, but when it was real prevalent and a big deal and everywhere. And
When it was
yeah,
the global pandemic.
and they found like a bunch of creative ways to to do the last episode of that season. They like mixed in animation and I will give them credit. Like it's not really relevant to what we normally do. I'm breaking my own rules a little bit, but I credit them for finding creative ways to tell that story instead of getting everyone sick and still making it work. Not that I saw it. This is something I'm hearing secondhand, but I thought it was a cool idea.
You're right. They did actually tie it in and have their little chunk of stories where they did talk about like they've had bioterrorism, but then they did also talk about actual like plagues and pandemics and incorporate that into the story to into an in an interesting way without just being like, "Hey, look, COVID." I appreciate that, and of course, my favorite thing about Blacklist, though, always eventually just comes down to one simple thing, and that's a man named James Spader, who I love in literally everything he's ever been in ever.
He's the quintessential kind of lovable rogue kind of character. The charismatic anti-villain or anti-hero, very charismatic, and despite the things they've done, they become very likable as a result.
No, he's just really good at that type of he's really good not just at that type of character, but he interjects his own specific style of speech and pontification and rumination and just as they called him 3 different times in the Blacklist, being a walking
Yeah,
anachronism. It's his aesthetic and his style, and he does a surprisingly good job of managing to consistently put that in every single character he plays
I
that
mean
I've seen.
that's part of the problem, though, right? Is that what's the character's name? Is it Red?
It's yes, it's well, it's Raymond. Oh no,
Raymond,
why am I forgetting his last
right?
name now? All of a sudden,
I
Raymond.
think it doesn't matter. The
Ah,
point is, I think that the fact that the actor and more importantly the character has such a strong charismatic present only illustrates even more when they go off with Elizabeth to do things that feel completely disjointed from the rest of the story.
yeah, it helps. It helps a lot when that stuff happens, and it's her going with Mr. Raymond Reddington instead of just going,
When
"Oh,
he's
my
not
family."
around, those moments it'll I think it can help, but it can also highlight the problem more when there's a very interesting, engaging secondary cast who are sidelined in favor of something that's not even the base premise of the show. It's exactly that
Yeah,
same problem I had with Scorpion.
exactly. Sometimes I look back and I just go, "What's this show called again?" Oh,
Yeah,
right,
so can
The
we focus on that,
Blacklist.
please? Which God, I have a long list of movie and TV here as well. I mean, all of my everywhere on this list is long except one, which I've only got in 3 segments. But that's the one we're least likely to touch on. So I might actually talk about a movie. Not a particularly like it was a decently big movie when it came out. It's not super popular now. It's not like art house cinema or anything like that either. So it might seem like a bit of an odd choice. But have you seen a movie called Man on Fire?
I have
It
not, but I have
came
heard of it.
out in the 2000s somewhere, like earlier, uh, early 2000s, like 2000, somewhere from like 2004 to 2006, probably. It's stars Denzel Washington and Dakota Fanning back when she was, a child. I think it was around the same time as the War of the Worlds movie with Tom Cruise and also uh, Dakota Fanning in it. Easy way to keep track of it: watch the actress become not a child anymore. That's how you time. That's how we carbon date movies.
Uh, there was a child character in this movie. Oh, yeah. Who is it? Oh, you know them. Them? What? They're older than me. Yes. So's the movie.
Yeah, not quite that old, but I mention it because
No, in this case, it's the book.
I didn't
Book
know.
is older
Was it
than
a
us.
book?
It says based on Man on Fire, 1980 novel.
Oh shit! I got to read that book. I wonder. I bring it up because you talked about character. We talked a lot about just now about the problems of character focus, right? And I think this movie does something really
Yeah.
cool because technically it's an action movie, right? Like a very standard action movie. It's about Denzel Washington's character is hired to basically bodyguard the daughter in this high profile family.
Yeah.
And it is an action movie in the second half, but it does something really interesting. And it spends the entire first, like, action movies normally aren't that long. But what this one does is the first half of this movie, which and it's not a short movie, but the first half of it is entirely spent just on developing the relationship between the bodyguard and this child. And he becomes almost
No.
like an uncle figure or a secondary father figure because, of course, her father's not really around that much. He's very busy. It's a very high profile family, and it showcases him like teach being a swim coach for her and things like that, and taking her to and from school. And it spends this first hour of the movie, just about, I think it is, just developing the bond between these two characters. And then in the second half of the movie, they have the girl get kidnapped and follow on the more actiony element of, the bodyguard getting the girl back.
Of
And
course. Gotta make sure to get those ratings and
but
bring
here's the
in the
thing,
normies.
that half of the movie becomes infinitely more engaging and dramatic and compelling because it's not just some random bodyguard. We've spent the whole first half of this movie coming to, one, like and care about the kid and what happens to her, and also about the relationship between this bodyguard and this child. So it matters deeply to him. He is very much prepared to die for this kid. And it makes it so much more gripping as a result.
I bet, yeah. I mean, we talked a lot before about how important it is, no matter what else is going on in the story, you have to be invested in the characters too. I almost nobody and almost no story has the capacity to be carried, no matter how good everything else is, if you don't even care about any of the
Yeah, I
characters.
mean, I love Taken. It's a fun movie. Liam Neeson's great. But I look at Taken and I look at this movie, and they're very similar in base premise. But as much as I like Taken, this one kind of blows it out of the water.
I bet. I mean, we don't get to see any of that development in Taken. Oh, why does he care and why is he so determined to get her back? She's his daughter. We didn't have to see anything. We didn't have to have it explained to us and shown to
Yeah,
us why their bond is so strong, why he's gonna go through all
we're
this. It's just
shown
my
so little
family.
of it, which makes it feel less tangible to us. And yeah, I think it's funny, like, this isn't what a movie that people would consider a masterpiece movie. It's not Saving Private Ryan, it's not Good Will Hunting, it's not any number of other movies that will go down in history and be remembered as a masterpiece. But I think the fact it did what it did has definitely had an impact on how I tell stories. Because, I mean, what's my biggest philosophy that keeps coming up all the time in this podcast when it comes to writing? It doesn't matter how exciting your plot is or how cool your action is if we don't care about the characters it's happening to. And I look back and I'm like, well, this movie probably had a lot to do with why I've come to that conclusion because it's the crystallization of it. It spends so much of its runtime not on the action, but on building up to why the action matters. And I imagine it would be hard to pull off and make it engaging, and hard not to make it super jarring to suddenly change from slice of life to action like that. But they did it, and it worked, and it's all the more impactful for it.
Oh man, that's we really need more. We really need more of that in series. You know, it's funny as you were talking about that. I was actually thinking of a similar thing. This is a bit of a genre jump here, so I'm not going to choose it to go into a whole thing. But it was making me think of an anime I really need to rewatch because watching it on Toonami, I was very confused and couldn't properly keep up all the. It's called Moribito. I think the Guardian of
I
the
have
Spirit.
never
I
heard
forget
of
what the
it.
subtitle is. It is also about a bodyguard protecting a child. And of course, it's a little easier for it to do since it's a series and not a movie, but it also spends a lot of time with the bodyguard and the kid just being together and developing their bond and spending time together before there's a bunch of action stuff and her doing badass anime fighting to try to save the
Yeah,
kid. And like they almost develop an entire little world and a network of characters because part of what they're doing is this kid she's protecting obviously can't live his big important normal life anymore, so they're essentially hiding out and on the move. And a big chunk of the first story we spend time in this little town where they're hiding out, and like the other kids in the town that the bodyguard is getting close to, or that the kid I mean is forming a connection to and getting close to, and the bodyguard not just taking care of him but also kind of feeling a little bit of motherly protectiveness towards the other kids as well, teaching them things, helping them develop a little bit more. And like it's really sweet and nice that even though the first thing we're told and shown about in the story is like, oh yeah, she's such a badass, she's such an amazing, great warrior. And we spend so much time just getting to know the characters and seeing them live their lives and starting to care about them before there's really much, if any, fighting at all. It doesn't try to be a huge, cool action story just because one of the main characters is supposedly a massive badass.
yeah. I mean,
And I appreciate
I
that.
think we talked about this before. It's the same thing as with the stuff like the MCU, right? The after party scene in Age of Ultron, despite that being one of the less interesting, less well written movies in the franchise, especially the Avengers movies specifically.
And
He
James Spader
was,
was
he
in that
was,
too.
yes.
He was Ultron.
But the after party scene, showing those guys just being friends and co-workers, did so much heavy lifting for the entire rest of that phase of those first three phases. I don't know, the first phases of the MCU, and showing how these people feel
Yeah,
about each
it's
other and things like
huge.
that. Like, despite it being one of the probably the worst of the Avengers movies, in my opinion, that one scene is so important to the character relationships that we come to know throughout the rest of those movies. And it's based on the same premise that we need to care about the characters as people if we want to care about the events they're a part of. But you mentioned something animated, and I think that is a very good segue as well to move on to the next sort of segment where we can pick something that is an animated TV show or movie.
Well, I've been looking at a few different things recently. Although, if my memory is gonna work with me on actually bringing up more than just the most recent, but the main two things I've been looking at recently are, well, I guess main three things are Doctor Stone, Owl House, and God bless it, Dunmeshi, or known by its awful English name, Delicious in Dungeon.
Well, if it helps you choose, I've not seen Doctor Stone or Don. I know the basics of what they're about. I've seen most of Owl House. I've seen the first 2 seasons. I think there's 3 seasons, or season 2 was released in 2 halves, maybe. I don't know.
There technically there is a season 3, but it's actually only 3 episodes because
Because the network.
to
Mm.
break kayfabe for a second, it kind of well, yeah, to break kayfabe for a second, we don't have explicit proof, but I'm gonna say there's a lot of really, really strong evidence that Owl House ending and getting canceled and having such a short season 3 was at least partially a massive case of Disney doing a big homophobia because Owl House is just too gay to continue on.
How dare it feature a wholesome homosexual relationship?
How can it be so awful as to blatantly let two girls be
Did you see
girlfriends?
them? They
I
held
mean, what's wrong with
hands.
them? Luz has already had boyfriends in the past. She's not even a lesbian. What's wrong with her kissing girls? Like it's
Yeah, I mean,
oh, and of course, let's not forget it also has a wonderful representation of a non-binary character who they never try to get into it and annoy us about anything. They just simply like Ida, the lady Ida, and a couple other characters just refer to Rain Whispers as they, and they never need to give us more context than that.
yeah, I definitely I don't have anything conclusive to say about that other than I have heard very similar things, and I think some of it came from the creators of the show. So,
I mean, I don't want to just blatantly blame it on something like that. It's if it is hard to escape the feeling simply because I never heard anybody say anything bad about Owl House, and it was doing gangbusters on ratings. It was like it was Disney. It's been Disney's like most successful, especially entirely original show in
yeah, I
such
mean, the
a
thing with that as
long
well
time,
is it
and
only
it did
takes,
so
like,
well.
a couple of executives in charge of that one thing to tank the whole thing based on their views. It doesn't even necessarily reflect on the whole company. But
No, that's fair
that's not what
too.
we're here to
Yeah.
talk about. We're just gonna make me mad if we
No,
get into that.
we're here to talk about the story. We're here to talk about the story and stuff, which is really good. I love
Yeah,
Owl
I need to
House.
finish it because the writing is impeccable. And it's one of those things where you're like, yeah, technically this is written for children. I don't give a shit. It's that good.
Sure is written for children, and it sure also does have dark, bloody secrets, existential crisis, lies that go on for hundreds of years and hurt so many people, an abandoned child who doesn't know about his origins, only for them to be heavier and darker than he could have ever prescribed. And of course, the most unchild friendly thing, the gays. In story context this time, not political.
Yeah, I mean it's very surface level, right? It's just a very fun deconstruction of a lot of the tropes that we grew up with and that the creators clearly grew up with. The the magical school and the fantasy otherworld and things like that.
I think it does a really good job of that too, especially because Luz doesn't even start going to the school until like right at
Yeah.
the end of season one.
One.
For almost the entirety of the first season, the school is just there.
But then on top of that, the world building is really quite interesting. Uh, of this bizarre other world and things like that. But I think where it really does shine is the narrative and is specifically the character work and the character writing.
Yeah, it's one of the strongest examples of an ensemble cast
I
I've seen
mean,
in a
Luz
long
is
time.
definitely the main character, but
But we also spend so much time not even always
true.
following her too.
And yeah, the characters, every character of any degree of significance has been fleshed out and developed and has compelling motivations and personal crises and any number of other things. It's it's not one of those shows where as an adult you can't enjoy it because it assumes its audience can't comprehend complex storytelling. And thankfully we are seeing less of that these days. There is much more animation, especially animation aimed at kids, that is written in a way that has complex narrative and actual character development.
Yeah, no, I mean, and Owl House, I think, also is even actually complex and smart enough. I think I enjoy it more now than
I
I would
agree.
have
I'm
when I
I'm in
was
the
a
same
kid.
boat. Like I would have definitely picked up on a lot of this stuff as a kid, but I don't think it would have mattered as much.
Yeah, I would be I would be getting mostly into a lot of the simpler parts of it, which are also great, but that's what they are. They're simple. They're there. They are story things and tropes we have seen and enjoyed so many times.
Yeah. And yeah, it's hard to cover everything because every character that matters has growth, has an arc, experiences change and things that matter for the most part. Even the ones that don't change dramatically, they are still compelling and multifaceted.
Yeah, they even end up making so much out of the little furry guy with a
Yeah,
skull on his
you
head who starts the series out just saying, "I am the great demon,
yeah,
worship me,
he
bow
seems like the
down."
comic
Bah.
relief joke character, and then the longer the series goes on, the more you go, "Oh, you're actually deeply psychologically damaged."
Yeah, King's got a lot going on, but you know what? It's a fitting name. We support him. He is a king.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those cases where the comic relief character ends up being one of the most deep and compelling characters in the show.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I can especially say where I am right now, like getting right to the end of season 2, King has even more stuff going on now than he did.
Yeah, and I mean, it does a fantastic job of like showing family, like familial trauma as well, and not in the and not and I don't mean in the sense of the way it is usually portrayed in media, especially media aimed at children, where it's, oh, the child has problems with their siblings or is doesn't mesh with their parents or whatever. The familial drama, I mean, we see that as well because Amity's family's got that sort of thing going on, but we see that that sort of thing can last into adulthood because so much of Ida's story is based around that. Her whole situation is because of her sister, because they never got along. They had all these problems and tensions that they never properly discussed and communicated.
All it took was like one single act of like sisterly frustration and jealousy that was handled poorly to blow itself out of proportion and have cascading consequences that would go on for most of both of their lives and bring them to completely opposite ends of their positions in life and opposing to the point of almost killing each other.
Yeah, it goes to show you how the consequences of acting in the heat of the moment, the lasting decades long consequences these things can have, and how much work it takes to then fix those problems. Not even fix the problem as such as repair the damage caused. I like that it shows that you can repair that damage if you put the effort in, if both parties put the effort in.
Yeah, and I really enjoy also both that like the pacing is like ugh I want to call the show almost perfect pacing in that different storylines and different things that are going on all have their own pacing unique to them, and it almost always feels like it fits that thing really well. The show has slow burns, instant explosions, and like slow burns that turn into infernos all going on at once and
Yeah,
almost
it makes for a
always done
very
well.
dynamic feeling. A very it makes the world feel very tangible and alive because all these different elements move at different paces and at the paces they need to move until it all eventually comes to a head when it's supposed to in a dramatic fashion.
Yeah, especially because, like, to go back to King for a second, We already talked a little bit about, he starts out just being a comic relief character. Then, in just a couple episodes, they make it clear that, like, he's already started to like Luz and they've grown close, and they're not just gonna, like, try to keep it away from us and have him sit there being pouty, like, no, I don't like the human who infantilizes me and calls me cute. She sucks. I'm a badass. And just then we get some of his family drama. We go through that for a while, and it's heavy, and it continues to be important to him, but also goes on the back burner for a while. And then, like, just in time for us to not be thinking about it that much anymore, or to think something's going to explode soon, we have a whole episode where it seems like all that's going to happen, only to have the moment that, like, actually made me want to cry, where, spoiler alert, for anybody who's not that far in, our moment of, like, King's way of wanting to move on from all the family stuff and not be stuck in it forever is formally becoming Ida's kid.
Yeah.
We get King Clawthorn, and it's so sweet.
And I mean, that's part of her whole character arc too, is her fucking warming up to outsiders other than her, you know, little gang of weirdos that is just her king and the doorknob. Um, yeah, it is her being willing to actually properly embrace healthy relationships with her family, with others, becoming this surrogate mother figure, and that's what makes the show so good. Is that the relationships between the characters, as well as just the characters themselves, are layered and complex and multifaceted, and that makes them compelling and interesting to watch. The overarching plotline is almost secondary.
Yeah. And but a nice touch is, like, they still keep it there. It's always relevant. It keeps coming back, and they manage to have it really feel like it matters in addition to all the other stuff going on. And, like, all good stories, the real weight and importance of the overarching plot isn't in the actual literal events where, like, okay, spoiler alert, you might have never guessed, but in this children's story with all this magic, there's an existential threat that could destroy everything.
Who would have
Oh
thought?
my goodness. The emperor with the big scary
Oh,
mask
you
is
don't say.
bad. He sure is. But they managed to make that all still feel so important and relevant, not because of the danger, but because all the important characters are rooted in it in one way or another, so oftentimes in ways that go beyond just they don't want to die and they don't want their friends to die,
It,
especially the main character, Luz, who not only from the beginning seems to have some sort of weird connection to Belos that we don't understand, despite the fact that she's literally from an entire other world and couldn't be less important in this one. And, like, of course, he's trying to find her way into the human world. And then we learn very early on, relatively, that so is Belos, which is an instant massive investment for Luz in the overarching plot. Because why does this guy who couldn't be further away, couldn't be more alien to where she came from and what she is, as far as we know, want the same thing as
yeah,
her?
and I mean, that's a greater example of like a great example of something that is happening throughout all of the show, which is all of those personal plot lines, almost all of them, are tied to his rule and the order he has created in some way. It's a very tightly written story, despite its complexities.
I I love it, even if I'm consistently weirded out by the way Luz's, like, overbite lip flap is drawn whenever she turns her head the wrong way, and I go, ugh.
Well, speaking of
Ugh.
animated series with very distinctive art styles, your segue you've given me has made my choice out of this list much easier. And by this was a long list to choose from, but I think I'm gonna pick something, take us a little bit somewhere a little bit darker and more existential. I have my pick for this be Serial Experiments Lain, which is an anime series from the 90s.
Yes. Something else we have also
I
talked about
think
on the
I
podcast
think
before, but who cares? Get over it. We're going
we've
to talk
touched
about
on
it
it, I
again. It's
think, but we've
great.
never really gone into it in any depth.
I I feel like we had an episode about it
I don't think we
back
did
around
it,
the
did we?
time that we also
Because if we did,
did
I'll pick something else.
well, wasn't Serial Experiments Lane well, we talked about it so much, maybe I could be getting some of it mixed up with the podcast, but I know,
I'm checking my site right
um,
now because
Lane
I'm like, "Oh, shit, have we done this already?" Uh,
because I know that was, like I think Lane was, what, the 2nd, story trade you and me did after
yeah,
ReZero and Higurashi?
it was definitely something I asked you to watch, I think before we even started the podcast.
I wanna say I remember us talking about the podcast, but we talked about it so much in general that it's hard to parse which of that was, being recorded and which wasn't.
I don't see it there.
Not that I care if we
Yeah,
did
no,
talk
it's not
about it
there.
before.
We didn't do
You
it.
can talk a
We're
lot
good.
about, the you could talk a lot about, internet: the
Yeah,
existential
so for those of
crisis.
you who don't know, it's a bit of a cult hit, because it was, it's an anime series that's from that era where anime still wasn't that big, in Western culture.
It's from an era where anime as a
Yeah.
genre was a cult hit.
Uh, Chances are you've seen art of it somewhere because, like, it's got a very distinctive art style. So if you Google it and and it looks familiar, it is. But we're not here to talk about the art, even if it is a really cool animation. What we're here to about is a story, and it is a very fucking bizarre story for one thing.
It's a story that you're probably gonna spend at least the first third of it, if not the first half, genuinely not sure what's going on.
Honestly, probably the whole show actually. It takes some processing.
Well, I mean, the whole show, you're gonna be confused, but I mean, I'd say that first half of it, you're literally gonna be staring at it, trying not to let drool drip down your lips as you're like, huh?"
Serial Experiments Lain follows the story of this girl, Lain. She's 12, I think, and is kind of this shy, introverted, reclusive character from a bit of an oddball from an oddball kind of family. And she gets her first computer and starts getting involved in the internet. And then reality sort of just starts breaking down around her more and more over time as the show deals with the idea of identity and the internet. This notion of people being able to be anybody online, be their truest self, or be something completely different to who they really are. This idea of the internet as this whole other world where you can be different versions of yourself, all of them parts of you, or maybe not.
There are so many different layers to both the philosophical ideas presented in Serial Experiments Lane and also what is literally happening. Like, I was about to mention the feelings of connection to others through these online mediums, but also the feeling of utter disconnect in the day-to-day life between all the characters. And then I realized, like, wow, that sounds like it's supposed to be a thesis statement on the entire thing, and it
Yeah,
is just one little
exactly.
piece of this
Yeah,
jumbled mess that's going on. But I thought about it because, like, one of the things that always hit me the most while I was watching it, and I think I even kept bringing it up to you over and over again while I was watching it and going through the episodes, is like, why does nobody seem to care about all this crazy stuff that's going on? Why is there so little reaction to
yeah. I
anything?
mean, when Ghost Lane appears in the sky, people definitely stop and but up until then,
But
because I
up
think that's
until
the first
then, I
time that
mean, even
something
as the
wild
world is
happens that
continuing to get
finally makes people go, but even then, people still to continue on with their lives.
yeah, because even earlier than that, we're seeing so many crazy, weird things going on, happening both to Lane and to some of the people around her. And then we just keep going back to the family
Yeah,
eating
and not
dinner, and
communicating at all.
nobody has anything to say.
Yeah, you're right. I talked about the like themes of the internet and identity, but there is also this idea of human connection. And it's interesting because the internet represents different things to so many different people in this story. To Lane, it's the thing that finally lets her be herself. It gets her out of her shell. And that is visually represented in the fact that, the deeper into the internet she goes, the less we see her in her protective bear snuggie. onesie rather.
And also the we see her almost literally coming to life because she might as well have
Yeah,
been a doll when the show started. She did not interact with, like, any part of life at all, and that's part of why her bear
but
was
she
such a
also
comfort
interacts
thing.
with the real world progressively less the deeper into the internet she gets, which is interesting.
Sh she is simultaneously finding connections and investment and growing more and more
From reality,
detached.
yeah. And she's not like it's centered primarily around her. Everything is in this story. It's her story. But you do get hit. But you do
She's
see
in the
how the
title.
internet affects other people. You get like
Her sister's a huge part of it. She's going on her own entire
yeah,
thing.
she's becoming like paranoid and having and breaking down because her world is starting to destabilize around Lane because of the themes of reality.
Even get to see, like, another layer of that disconnection, like, with the parents, because 'cause we're centered so much on Lane, but then we see when the sister starts freaking out, the parents don't have much of a reaction or
No,
any investment in that either. Like, at first, you think Lane is the outcast, and it's like, no, there is no communication or, like, warmth in this whole family.
and later we learn that this family is basically not real. They're
They might as well be
yeah,
fake.
and, there's other things as well, we have characters who are driven to suicide in the first episode, but then they exist on within the internet because, of everything that of themselves they've left there. We have poor Alice. Um,
Oh, oh,
we touch on the just potential for invasions of privacy that the internet has that we don't need to go too much into here. But oof, as her fucking private thoughts and experiences end up online for the world to see, and that wrecks her shit
yeah, as it very sadly has happened
to so many real people.
both in different ways, but also almost verbatim to her story to so many real people.
We see all these different versions of Lane that simultaneously exist within the internet, representing all these different facets of herself, and we get which raises the question, which one is really her, and that's a question that bothers her as well as she's trying to figure out, which of these versions of me is the real me at this point, especially being so disconnected from the physical world.
Yeah, and that ties back in well to the death thing you mentioned too, because that's the same thing that's happening with these people, that despite the fact that they are literally dead, there are specters of them, traces of who they are on the internet where they have put so much of themselves into, given to them so much of themselves that it's almost a new existence that is there that doesn't even rely on them still being alive to
Yeah,
continue.
I mean, we've even got this character who is like god of the internet, basically. Except, is he really? Because that's a whole thing.
Mhm.
And he has he's having a existential crisis that mirrors Lane as he is trying to move more and more into reality and expand his like realm. It's and
I don't want to be fake anymore.
he just can't do it the way he wants to, and it's so incredibly deep, both narratively and thematically and psychologically. And the craziest thing about it is that you have to remember this was created in the 90s. The internet was not a huge part of our culture yet.
Yeah, it's Metal Gear levels of like prescience in narrative.
This was at the point where the internet was still in its fledgling. We were still, you know, a decade off of social media like becoming a thing. Most people didn't have an email. Everyone was still on dial.
There's tons of stuff that would only happen years or decades later in the real world that was essentially predicted in the course
Yeah,
of
and
this
the
show.
aesthetics aren't the same, obviously, because it didn't really exist that way yet. But the version of the internet that we have ended up with is eerily similar to this darker version, this that well, that exists both in reality and in Lain. And I'm saying this as someone who deeply loves the internet. You know, it is I've my illness has meant I've had to spend a lot less time out in reality than I once did, you know? And I have and because being able to connect with people online has made that significantly easier to deal with. I've connected with incredible people. Most of my friends I have met exist all over the world, and I've met through the internet. John, I know from the internet.
Yep, and it's the same with me too. Like we come from an entire shared community of people who have only met really through and because of the internet, and like
Yeah.
from all over the world, and yet somehow have become such like a close-knit goofy little international
Yeah, I
community.
mean, some of us have met in person now and in varying configurations, which is cool, but it all most of our interactions still stem, well, except for the ones that you know, live together and stuff. Um, most of our interaction still stems from online communication, and it is a very real, tangible community of very real close friends that could not exist without this wonderful thing. But at the same time, I still when I watch Lain, get that weird sort of almost uncanny valley feeling of looking at the dark reflection. This version of the internet that does exist that no one wants to really acknowledge, that was predicted, and all these problems related to the internet becoming what it is, this basically secondary world almost. And all of this was predicted by this one guy in the 90s before the internet was really a big thing. He saw all of
Yeah,
this. It's wild.
which is like again, like I love the idea of prescience in media, because to go back to what I said earlier again for a second, like it's eerily similar to what the situation was with Metal Gear. Metal Gear is also very weird and esoteric, and obviously looks nothing like the real world, has a ton of things that are so different, and yet it talked about all these things like memes and the information age leading to governments having more and more control over the world, regular people becoming smaller and smaller in scale and having less say in how things go, even as their lives don't outwardly seem to change immediately from what they can tell. Like all these things that were written by one person, and then if you look at it, even though it didn't literally happen the same way, you're like, oh, that's kind of just
Yeah,
reality
that's the
now.
thing. That's the craziest thing about Lane is that I I didn't see it in the 90s. I saw it for the first time in I think somewhere between 2013 and 2016 probably. And I imagine like watching that in the 90s and you would have gone, "Wow, this is such an incredibly layered philosophical thing." And then you watch it now in the sort of more contemporary era and you're like, "Holy fuck."
Oh, wait a minute. Some of
Yeah,
this is
like
just
this
stuff
is
that happened.
like obviously the more sci fantasy sci-fi elements of it aren't what we have, but thematically, metaphorically, philosophically, so much of it is just what the world became in reality that you sort of look at it and go, "Were you from the future?" It's insane
And
how it's
it's
only become more
crazy
topical with
looking at the
time.
actual influence. Yeah, it really has. Both it and the like massive amount of influence that the internet has had on the world, both in and out,
You're,
because a lot of those feelings and isolation um
you're
that we
sorry, no, I'll let you
huh?
finish.
Oh, there's a lot of those feelings we see that were there aren't new problems that came to exist with the internet. A lot of them existed before the internet, and the internet made it better, which is why we see the positive sides of it and people forming connections and everything. But like you got this massive dichotomy of, even as it made some things better, we see not only some new problems it presented, but some problems that already existed that it made worse. It truly is like, I almost want to call it like the penultimate tool of humanity, and that it fits the definition of what a tool is so well, and also fits all the quantum mechanics aspects that it has in Serial Experiments Lain, because the internet is an entirely different thing that has entirely different effects on the world and people's experiences every single spot you
Yeah, it
look.
is. It is just. It shows the internet as a world attached to reality, but that is brings out all of the extremes of reality. It's kind of like what like the Fey realm is depicted in like a lot of fantasy. But just think of it this way to give it a hint to you guys, to our audience, how prescient this is. You are listening right now to versions of John and I that exist frozen in time on the internet, and that in theory will continue to
Yeah, and
exist
especially
as
if you look
pieces
at
of
like
ourselves left behind
equivalents,
long after
podcasts
we
that
are
have been
dead.
going on like way longer than ours, those are entire identities. Those are digitized versions of people that now exist regardless of what happens to the people they came from now on.
Yeah, it's it's like watching a movie with a dead actor in it and being like, "Wow, this is weird," but taken to an extreme. But I don't want to spend too long on this because obviously this is already a much longer episode than usual. So let's move on to video games. You've talked about Metal Gear a bit, so you
I
do keep
love
providing us with handy segues.
Metal Gear. But I've been bouncing between a few different interesting and enjoyable video games recently. It's slightly hard to pick one. So I think I'll go with what's been my comfort one for a while, especially because as awesome as it is a video game, like Legends of Zelda Tear of the Kingdom. Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. It's maybe I shouldn't, because there's not as much story to talk about in the main story, but wow, there are so many.
I mean, you can discuss Zelda as a broader franchise if you want.
There
I'm
are
not
so many
super
smaller
familiar with
things
it
going on, and
as a
I
franchise
do
myself,
actually
but
like looking at the overall big expansive world of Zelda, because its commitment to having different incarnations and reincarnations of the stories, the character, and the world allows this one franchise to tell such a wider variety of stories than we usually get from like a video game franchise, despite the fact that it has a lot of repeating themes and elements and names. It like hell, you could almost say I think that you could almost say I would say the Legend of Zelda series. It's fitting that it has reincarnation in it, because I almost feel like it is the perfect metaphor and or allegory for what reincarnation is as far as video games go, because it's made and remade over and over again. Everything repeats in an endless cycle, and yet everything changes even as it happens again and again. Every Legend of Zelda game is its own microcosm, its own world with its own stories to tell, and yet not only are they all connected, but they ultimately are also the same, even as they're different. There are so many different incarnations of Link, and it seems like the name always changes, but really, when you think about it, for instance, most Legend of Zelda games uh, let you name Link. Link is actually more of a title than a name, because that's what he is. He is the hero. He is the thing that links the player to the world and links all the worlds together by repeating through over and over again. That's why it's kind of called The Legend of Zelda, not The Legend of
yeah.
Link. But like
Well, I mean,
yeah, of
Zelda also
course.
reincarnates, I guess. I
But
suppose, but
also
it's
for
still
the
kind
most
of
part,
odd.
Zelda changes a lot less through the different incarnations than Link does, except for a couple notable
That's
ones,
fair.
which is nice because recently, like we've got We've got Tetra in the Wind Waker, and the version of Zelda in Breath of the Wild is also very, very different from all the others. I mean, she's literally like a robot. She's in this magical, fantastical world and comes from a bloodline of people with crazy, intense magic powers and connections to the gods. And she's a nerd who wants to dig around in the dirt and do archaeology and learn about robotics and machines.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not super familiar with the Zelda franchise, but what I do know of it is is what you talk about, like the all these different timelines, this cyclical universe, and that's one of the things I would like about it, especially from what I understand of the more recent ones, Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, is that you get it. It never leaves it all behind. It's not like it's not doing what The Simpsons does, right, where it just has a completely fluid timeline. It's a long lasting,
And
occasionally
everything that
branched
happens
timeline
happened.
of repeating cycles, and everything is part of the canon, but historically, not just everything is canon. And sometimes it shows you or hints to you how long standing and old and vast this world
Yeah,
actually is,
it's wild.
which
Tears of
is
the Kingdom is actually one of the
very
strongest
cool.
examples of that timeline thing you mentioned. Well, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. That's both one world. One of
I would say because they have
But yeah,
locations
not
that are
just that.
effectively
You want to know
places that
something
exist in other
really,
games, but
really
ruined,
wild?
right?
Despite Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, at least as far as it was explained to us, being like furthest in the timeline. It's like it's so far in the timeline that most of the events
Yeah,
of all the other Zelda games aren't even history anymore. The world has the world has reset
yeah, like
more than
legend.
once since most of that stuff happened. And like the bit of context that makes it feel really crazy comes specifically in Tears of the Kingdom, where despite the fact that these two games take place after all that other stuff took place, it has to be even further apart than we thought. Because Tears of the Kingdom talks about a lot of stuff that was 10,000 years ago. Spoiler alerts, by the way, for Tears of the Kingdom. I'm not going to say too much, but like stuff that takes place literally 10,000 years ago with an entirely separate race of progenitors from the Hylians, one of whom literally founded the kingdom of Hyrule. And we had 10,000 years between that and when we get to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom and all the stuff that happened. And like, despite we had that 10,000 year gap and eras and the death and rise and reshaping of the world and its nations and its kingdoms again and again in the timeline of this singular pair of games that takes place after all the others. But yeah, like it's wild to me. I don't think there's any other like I don't think there's any other timeline out there that's attached to one series and only comes from things that actually literally exist, i.e., video games, um, that has such a sprawling and like a sprawling timeline with so many events, eras, even like you could probably say epochs or epics. I don't know what the proper way to pronounce it is in it. Like
Yeah,
as like the only thing I could think of to compare is maybe like Warhammer and Warhammer 40K, but the reason there is so much more lore and story to that than like anything else is because most of it is just the written word. Most of it is just a bunch of different writers who have bits and pieces of the license all writing their own things. It's
yeah,
not really one solid timeline created by a couple groups of people like the Legend of Zelda one is, which is crazy.
yeah. I mean, the two closest examples I can think of are the Star Wars universe, which is again spread across many different types of media, but is
I'd say it
similarly
is if you actually
ridiculously long
really,
and
really look
expansive,
into
or
it,
maybe
but
not
it's not
quite
all
as much
just
as
there on
Zelda.
display for you. You gotta go looking.
Yeah, exactly. And the only other one I can really think of is Faerun, the like
Yeah, the
OG
universe of
central
Dungeons and
like
Dragons.
D&D setting.
Well, sorry, yeah.
Well, one of them. The
The
cosmology there
original
is
as far as I'm
complicated,
aware.
but yeah, I think it's the original. It's also not even the full part of like Faerun is a continent on Toril, um, but you know that that setting has evolved linearly. They don't reset it with every new edition. Every new edition has just added to the lore, which is why something that was came to be in the 70s, we're now in the 2020s. So it has a very complicated, long, and expansive lore because of the way they've done that up till now. Those are the only two things I can think of that are comparable. And of the two of those, only Faerun really has the same tendency of Zelda for it all to kind of still matter in some way. With Star Wars, the different eras feel so far apart and distinct outside of the Skywalker saga, which is not
It
necessarily a
makes it
bad thing,
feel like
but it's
less
definitely very
like a
different to
timeline,
Zelda's timeline.
and I that's partially because The Legend of Zelda has reincarnation as a big part and these don't, but a lot of it really is more in that everything in the Zelda timeline, despite being a little weird sometimes, is so concrete because it all comes from one thing. Everything important in the Legend of Zelda timeline is either something that literally happened on screen in one of the video games or something we were told about directly by somebody on screen in one of the video games. And like it's crazy to think about Star Wars has all this crazy and amazing history. Um but Darth Revan from Knights of the Old Republic doesn't have anything to do with Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi going on their Clone Wars adventures and then the Empire forming and all that.
No, it's completely distinct from all of that stuff. There is thousands of years between them and very little that really links them together. And there's things that happened before him that happened thousands of years before that are
Yeah.
part of the
The
lore. They've
only
contributed to
real
the world, but they have
connecting
very little
thing between
relevance to
all those
his
different
story.
eras of Star Wars, besides obviously them being the same franchise, is the Force. The Force and the galaxy as we know it, and that's it. And like I enjoy that, especially because
Yeah.
despite how much we've talked about the overarching connections and everything, I also love the individual, smaller scale stories of Legend of Zelda. Despite all of its grandiosity and the huge scale of the world and the timeline and all its resets, it has so many small, intimate stories to tell when you're paying attention and going through really most of the games, but especially a couple specific, like, good dimension ones. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom have a lot of those going on, but like one of the best examples, everybody's favorite like cult classic weird not like the other Zelda games but still amazing, is Majora's Mask is almost nothing but an interconnected weave of a bunch of really small intimate stories for you to track down.
Yeah, you can do some very incredible things with a vast universe. It's difficult to pull off sometimes, but the bigger the universe is, the more stories you can tell in that universe. And you can choose how connected you want them to be. But since we are starting to
Yes.
run real long, I think I'll push us along and I'll touch on. I I had a couple of options for this. I was originally thinking I was leaning towards doing The Last of Us or To the Moon perhaps, but I think actually what I want to talk about is some lesser known games. Orwell and its sequel, Orwell Ignorance
I
is
have not.
Strength.
I
Have you
my
played
ears
them?
do perk up at the name Orwell though.
Well, yeah, they're named after George Orwell for a reason. But I think they are interesting ones to pick because the way those stories are told, you could not tell
Those are always
outside
the
of a
best
video
video game
game,
stories.
right? Because the it's very simple the way it is actually executed effectively. Your screen, the mechanical parts of the game, is just effectively the characters you are inhabiting. It's their PC. It's their work computer and all the assorted apps and things attached to it. And obviously, it's called Orwell for a reason. These are games that are dealing with different aspects of totalitarianism, and they put you in the shoes of a person in a not not high level but important role within
George
that
Orwell does have a pattern
totalitarian
about him.
government. And yeah, Orwell, the uh the first one is primarily about
Big Brother.
focusing on surveillance. Uh, yeah, kind of. You there's been a series of terrorist attacks basically, and it's your job to solve those attacks and figure out like the story, why they're happening, what's going on, and use your power to like find the culprits and all that stuff. But it also, because of your position in the government, you have a- access to a lot of very powerful surveillance that is very unethical, but really you're the NSA on steroids, and I already have thoughts on the NSA.
Don't worry, they know.
You know, you yeah, I'm sure they do. They I'm in Australia, fuck you. um, like that matters. But it's the first one basically your deals with surveillance. It deals with how you can use surveillance and invasion of privacy and things like that to follow that path to the answer and solve the crime. And it gives you choices. You can choose how you want to use this power, how much you want to involve yourself with it. And part of the way the narrative plays out is you see how your actions as this person in this position with this degree of power to invade privacy and survey citizens affects the lives of the people you are investigating as part of this investigation, and that has an impact on how it
Oh,
all
I love
ends, which
layered
is
stuff like that.
really cool. Because not only is just the mystery a compellingly written mystery and the characters are fairly interesting, but by putting you in this position, because you're really just playing a version of yourself. You choose your name and your icon and everything, and you interact with the game through this very simplistic I'm on the computer layout. And what better way to show the how powerful and potentially dangerous this kind of surveillance and level of government scrutiny is than to put you in the position of someone with that power? And then the sequel, Ignorance is Strength, you're still part of the same nation, which is just called the Nation, somewhere in Europe, it seems. It has some like vaguely Soviet flavor, but it's a focused around a murder primarily. That's where the mystery and everything comes in. But it's focused primarily on propaganda and how you manipulate information and use that, and you use your ability to manipulate information to eke out more of the mystery and influence things like that. And in doing so, you kind of can start stumbling upon conspiracies and things like that, and start having some control over how those conspiracies are portrayed to the world and things like that, because you are in a position where your job is to manipulate propaganda.
It really reminds me a lot of that game I keep forgetting the name of, where you have to be a radio show host with this relatively like corrupt government that wants to have influences on your broadcasts and stuff here and there, as like a bunch of political unrest is happening outside in the real world while you're in your studio.
Yeah, they are. They are fantastic games with dealing with some, like, very poignant and always relevant themes to explore, and they do so in such a creative way of storytelling that you could only do through the medium of video games, and they're just so well done. Highly recommend it, and they're not even particularly expensive. So, if you have the chance and that sounds interesting to you,
Yeah, I'm
go
gonna wish
play
list them
those
right now.
games. They're incredible. On that note, we've been recording for a while, and we haven't even gotten into as many things as we could. There's still many more movies, TV series, games, books, comics we could touch on. We didn't get into other forms of storytelling that aren't generally that possible to explore to any depth on in our episodes, like music or tabletop games or anything like that, because there's just so much. So plenty more for us to cover in
Yeah.
the future when we come back for season 3. But for now, and other projects, haha. But for the time being, I think it is a good idea to leave it here before this becomes a 6-hour episode because I've been here for the whole time, and I got to tell you, obviously I have. I got to tell you, I didn't really notice anywhere that would have been a great place to cut it into a part one, part two
Yeah.
situation or anything like that. So I think we're stuck with the real long format. Um, and maybe that'll drive some people away. Maybe some people will just have it in the background whilst they're doing their work or something. I don't
I'm
know, but
fine. Plenty of my existence is in the background.
let us know if you want less of this. Let us know if you want more of it. But for now, if you are listening to this on Spotify or YouTube, you can also find these episodes on my website, radfordwrites.com. So actually, I don't know why I start with saying if you're on Spotify or YouTube, because I know for a fact far more people are listening to this from the website. But yeah, it's also on radfordwrites.com. I also share stories I've written there. Some for these, mostly the ones I do for the podcast, but others, some other extras like other shorts, other poems, things like that. I also put articles up. You can find links to buy my books there, which I very much appreciate people doing. And soon you will be able to access other things. Whilst this podcast is on hiatus, epilogue should be out soon. I'll release an actual date for that later,
Ooh.
but that's coming. And eventually we'll be back for season 3. And of course, you can find plenty more of John over on YouTube and Twitch, streaming as Sephir, Sephear. He is just as
Yeah.
entertaining there as he is here.
The setup is finally better, even if it's ghetto as hell and still not perfect yet. I'm going to be streaming much more consistently now, and started that, not to timestamp the podcast since it doesn't really matter, but last night was first like repeated podcast in a while, and now we're going steady.
All right. So until then, we will see you. Well, in epilogue actually, because that will come out first. But in season 3, goodbye.